When you don't talk about the Christian faith in public, actually it's not that nothing gets talked about. You get other people manipulating media, manipulating education.
Political correctness threatens our democracy because it says that certain topics are off limit. There's just things that we just can't talk about.
If you lose your faith in God, you cannot actually have liberty at the end of the day.
G'day and welcome to Clayton Today. I'm Rod Earnshaw, and in this series we've been discussing threats to 21st century liberal democracy. Today we're looking at freedom and tolerance, and joining me is David Holloway, the Vicar of Jesmond Parish Church in the UK. Great to have you with us again.
Thank you, Rod.
David. David, we've been looking at threats over the last few weeks. Today we want to look more positively at freedom and tolerance. And I guess the starting point would be to say, what does freedom mean in a free democracy? So can you tell us what that means?
Well, freedom or liberalism, or true liberalism, not libertarianism, true liberalism is where there's freedom for ideas. This is the whole Western tradition. But there have to be ideas of beliefs and thoughts about morality and so forth and so on. But there have to be restraints, and there always has been in the tradition, and that is restraints against sedition, against gross sexual immorality, and against violence, and also freedom of expression. And again, with restraints on things like libel, against seditious writing, blasphemy and obscenity. That has been the classical understanding of liberalism. Freedom of ideas and freedom of expression.
So freedom in a free democracy doesn't necessarily mean complete absolute freedom to do whatever we want, whenever we want, say whatever we like, whenever we like it. There's always been this idea of constraints. And I guess that really does seem quite different from the sorts of things we often hear today in political discussion in the media. So how has that idea come about? Where has that idea come from?
Well, it goes back to the wars of religion. This is where there was a sea change. In the 17th century, people were fighting each other over beliefs. They had been obviously in the 16th century. In Europe, it was Catholic and Protestant. But then there came the change after the English wars of religion with John Locke. It was a Puritan reaction. John Locke, John Milton. John Locke with his Letters of Toleration, which began in 1689, and John Milton with his arguing for a free press. Locke argued exactly that ideas must be free and no longer should you be burnt at the stake for what you believed. And the consequence of Milton's writing was the Parliament not renewing the Licensing Act in 1694. That stopped pre-publication censorship, which was a huge and significant change. Macaulay called it more significant than the Magna Carta or the Human Rights Act.
Yeah. So just going back to John Locke for a moment, you talk about letters of toleration.
Yes.
That toleration was really the equivalent of tolerance, as we might say today. That suggests, when you talk about that with religious freedom, that suggests that he thought tolerance was quite an important aspect of freedom in democracy. Can you tell us a little bit about what he meant by tolerance?
Yes, well, as I've explained, tolerance means you don't put someone to the stake when you disagree with their beliefs, and like Archbishop Cranmer had been burnt at the stake. And what happened with Locke, he said that the magistrate, who in the past, or the lawyer, the judge, who would have sentenced people to death, must no longer do that. So what you do is you don't celebrate intoleration, belief that you disagree with. By definition, you only tolerate what you disagree with. But what you don't do is criminalize it and bring the state to exercise force, as it were, restraint, physical restraint, punishments, to actually affect beliefs. That was the really distinctive understanding of tolerance. It's not celebration, it's actually a refusal to exercise the law to engage in that particular thing you're disagreeing with.
So it's toleration presupposes disagreement.
Indeed.
But you allow people to hold variant views.
Whereas now, we can discuss this later, tolerance has shifted to something that is totally different and really quite intolerant.
Well, we'll get on to that later, but it might be worth just exploring briefly what that looked like, what effect that had for people with very different views at the time when that came in.
The classic case that many people have heard of is John Bunyan, who wrote the classic The Pilgrim's Progress, which he wrote in prison. And he was a nonconformist. He wouldn't conform with the state law of those days.
So prior to John Locke, in Bunyan's time, he could be imprisoned.
He was imprisoned, of course, and
non-conformity.
he died, sadly, just for himself, just before the Act of Toleration.
Had he been around, what would the situation have looked like for him? How would it have been different?
The nonconformists, like Baptists and so forth, were able to worship and able to meet together. And things, of course, today, though, are changing back. And,
well, maybe it's worth sort of coming on to those a little bit. Do we still experience the same tolerance and freedom
Well,
today?
no, we don't. I mean, at the moment, you're getting cases of street preachers in England who actually, it's only over specific things, I mean, who are not being aggressive, not being wrongly homophobic, but express the view that, say, homosexual activity, not people, but activity is wrong, are getting investigated by the police.
Is that really happening in the UK? People
Yes, and even wanting to. There was a case of the Roberts. They just wanted to, people in Lancashire who wanted to put some Christian literature in public libraries because there was a big campaign, a pro-gay campaign, which there was a freedom to do. But they said, could they put some Christian literature around, or could they just advertise something? And they were investigated by the police, and it was unbelievable what went on.
What was the critique of the police in that situation? What were they investigated for?
Well, they were arguing it was homophobic hatred and so forth. The ideas, by definition, now almost are to be criminalised, which of course is fundamental. And it's not just that, it's on positive things as well, where you're getting in hospitals, nurses perhaps wanting to pray with a patient, or perhaps even wearing a cross, a symbol of Christian belief. All these things actually are no longer tolerated, which is actually quite frightening. And this is very, very different. And you get so many different cases. I mean, and even, it's very interesting that this has generated a culture of, as it were, opposition to belief, which is sort of endorsed by the state. An interesting phenomenon I just noticed watching a football match when Drogba, many of us are amazed by his football skills. He crosses himself every time he scores a goal. I have never yet heard on the BBC or the ITV, other channels, a commentator actually commenting on that. They normally try and think up all sorts of little trivia about the characters, don't they? You know, who their grandmother was and goodness knows whatnot during the game. I've never noticed or never heard anyone comment on the fact that he crosses himself.
So there's almost sort of anything religious is just off limits.
Yeah. And there is a sort of intolerance now of that.
So we've sort of covered this a little bit, but it's perhaps worth just tightening that up a little bit. Would you say then that we use a very different definition of tolerance today as it was in Locke's time?
Yes, I mean, I think what has happened, tolerance is now shifted to being really indifference. And certainly tolerance means not only do not criminalise, but you may not even speak about the things you disagree with.
So you've sort of lost the concept of disagreement almost.
Yeah. And that's very, very dangerous in a civilised society where there needs to be civil discussion and civil disagreements and open. An open society doesn't mean that no one says anything, and that's what we've got. We've got a kind of neutral, an idea of a naked public square, and anybody who actually argues for anything on certain moral grounds, and particularly they're defined by a secular minority, namely, say, homosexual behaviour. That's a classical one. But of course, the people who want to talk about that don't just want to talk about homosexual. They want to talk about total morality, marriage, and so forth. That's just one minor point. And also with regard to religion. And there's worries there because people are obviously afraid of extremist Islam. But I mean, you must be able to be discussing these things if you're going to have a liberal society. I mean, true toleration implies true liberalism.
As in, we can disagree, but we can disagree and speak about it and not
but not fight each other. And that, I think, is a great difference between the Christian tradition, dare I say it, and other traditions. I mean, particularly, like sadly in some states and some Islamic states, where you get people wanting to execute people for moral behaviours, where the Christian tradition does not argue for that. It actually says, no, these are wrong, this is sinful. But it's because of the Christian doctrine of hell that God actually allows us to be free, and therefore at that point the generality of the Christian tradition feels that we should allow other people to be free, so long as they don't get to a point where, with the Lockean
behaviours
position, the behaviours are seditious or grossly immoral, and therefore affecting the community and from being promoted and also violent.
Okay, David, thanks very much. I think you covered that in quite good detail. I guess the question for us is, as Christians, how do we have an impact? How can we sort of reverse this movement from tolerance to whatever it is that we have now that we call tolerance?
I think we need to get the government to repeal some of its equality legislation. That is particularly one of
this equality and diversity legislation is really pushing the promotion of things that once upon a time might have been tolerated.
So there's a range of issues that need to be dealt with. But also, I think, but also Christians, I think sometimes are too laid back and too frightened because they hear of these cases, and therefore maybe some people sometimes in these cases, not most of the cases, I may say, that I've personally been aware of and supporting, but some people may do indiscreet things. But normal, sensible affirmation of Christian truth, strongly argued, should be actually the part of the normal Christian person's way of living.
So we need more of that, not less.
Not be frightened because of these laws, because there are human rights, and the European Convention of Human Rights has Article 9, which is freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and Article 10 is about freedom of expression, and also Article 14 is about the prohibition of discrimination. And the point, Christians may not be discriminated against. I think what's been going on, there's been all sorts, everybody else has been free, but now Christians are being discriminated against, and Christians just need to be polite and sensible and act as in a liberal society.
Thanks, David. Now, obviously, we've only just touched on this very much on the surface of things. If people want to look in a little bit more depth, can you recommend somewhere or some resources they might be able to look at?
Well, actually, I've written on tolerance in Church of the State in the New Millennium, published by HarperCollins. Also, the Christian Institute website has got cases of modern intolerance. And of course, people can download John Locke's Letters of Toleration from the internet.
Great. Well, thanks, David. That's been very helpful. And thank you for watching. There's a lot of talk today about tolerance and freedom, but the reality is often very different. I hope this program has shed some light on why that is and on what you can do where you are to make a difference. Do join us for more next time on Clayton Today. See you then. Goodbye.